Chers amis, au nom des bibliothèques de l'Université McGill, bonjour et bienvenue. Je suis Guylaine Baudry, doyenne des bibliothèques et titulaire de la chaire Trenholm. Avec l'équipe des bibliothèques de McGill, je suis ravie de vous accueillir à cette conférence par laquelle nous célébrons le don d'une collection exceptionnelle de l'un des auteurs les plus influents et célèbres du 18e, des Lumières, François-Marie Arouet, dit Voltaire. For those who are tuning into the live stream, we are here from the Faculty Club Ballroom on McGill University campus. Before we begin, I want to recognize that McGill University is located on land that has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. McGill acknowledges and thanks the diverse indigenous peoples whose presence has enriched this territory on which peoples of the world now gather. May we dedicate ourselves to moving forward in the spirit of partnership, collaboration, and reconciliation as we learn together and contemplate the possibilities that lay ahead. Before we dive into Voltaire, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the presence of my colleague, Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Professor of Philosophy here at McGill, Lisa Shapiro. Hello, Lisa. As well as conference attendees from the executive of the Canadian Society for 18th Century Studies. It was really a good timing. And of course, to all of you, I am delighted to welcome everyone to this special lecture and celebrate the story of a precious family collection of documents with you. The Jacqueline Lambert David Voltaire Manuscript collection spans 4 generations and includes 1,500 pages of manuscripts related to Voltaire, one of the most celebrated authors, philosophers, satirists, and provocateurs of the French Enlightenment. Cette collection a récemment été confiée aux bibliothèques de McGill par le professeur Peter Lambert David Southam de l'Université de Sherbrooke. This estate gift is a treasure trove of historical handwritten documents consisting of letters, poems, essays, memoirs, notes, legal documents, trial testimonies, and architectural drawings, many of which have never been published before. It offers a unique window into the life and mind of Voltaire. The history of this collection is equally captivating. It traces its origins back to Voltaire's estate in Ferney and has been nurtured by 4 generations of the Lambert-David family, eventually culminating in Professor Peter Southam's decision to entrust this invaluable treasure to McGill University libraries. This estate gift is a crucial moment for the McGill Voltaire collection due to the addition of manuscript material. With the former acquisition of the J. Patrick Lee Voltaire collection in 2013 and a 2022 donation from Professor Edward Langille, McGill now houses 350 manuscripts relative to Voltaire. The Jacqueline Lambert David Voltaire Manuscript collection adds immense depth and richness to McGill's already formidable holdings of the Enlightenment period, now making McGill's collection one of the most important Voltaire repositories of books and manuscripts in North America. This is a unique opportunity of importance and benefit to McGill University, Montreal, and Quebec as a whole. I want to thank Professor Southam. Thank you for trusting McGill with this very personal, remarkable set of materials. Your vision, collaborative spirit, and commitment to sharing this collection with researchers on a global scale are to be commended. We are honored to accept the stewardship responsibility and preserve, give access, and enhance the student and scholarly experience by animating the collection in different ways, as is being done with the current exhibition that I invite you to see on the 4th floor of the McLennan building, Rare Books and Special Collections, and tonight's lecture. We accept this responsibility on behalf of our university, and in so doing, we know that our successors will perpetuate our commitment. This is what librarians and archivists are doing. among other things. We can say we are taking this commitment in front of you for centuries and centuries. I would now like to call upon Professor Southam to say a few words about the Jacqueline Lambert David Voltaire Manuscript Collection. Professor Peter Southam is a retired professor from the Université de Sherbrooke, Department of History. His research interests include the social cultural history of Quebec in the 20th century, urban and regional histories, the history of health and medicine, and the history of immigration of the Irish in Quebec. Peter Southam.
Eh bien, je voudrais tout simplement expliquer que même si cette collection a été rassemblée par 4 générations de la famille Lambert-David, elle porte le nom de ma mère, Jacqueline Lambert-David, pour de bonnes raisons. Elle en a assuré la préservation pendant 50 ans. Elle l'a développée à partir d'importants ajouts. Et comme elle habitait à Ottawa depuis la guerre, c'est elle qui l'a amenée ici au Canada. Alors, au fond, elle est la personne qui est le plus responsable du fait qu'elle soit aboutie ici. Et je suis très confiant que cette collection est maintenant d'excellentes mains dans le Rare Book and Special Collections département de McGill. Merci.
Thank you so much for sharing those words with us. I now have the honor of introducing a great friend of both Professor Southam and McGill University, tonight's lecturer and 2023 recipient of an honorary doctorate of literature at McGill, Professor Nicholas Cronk. Nicholas Cronk is Professor of European Enlightenment Studies at the University of Oxford, Directeur of the Voltaire Foundation and Président de la Société des études voltairiennes. Cronk is an author, professor, and pioneer researcher. He is one of the world's preeminent Enlightenment scholars while standing at the forefront of digital humanities technology. His work has been and remains crucial in the development of digital humanities research and is broadening the understanding of 18th century civilization. Professor Cronk was the general editor of the complete works of Voltaire, the first critical edition of the totality of Voltaire's writings. He is now leading the planning of the digital edition of Voltaire's complete writings as part of the new initiative titled Digital Enlightenment. Le professeur Cronk et son équipe à la Fondation Voltaire ont joué un rôle crucial dans le projet de numérisation de la collection de manuscrits voltairiens Jacqueline Lambert-David. Nos plus sincères remerciements d'avoir rendu accessible gratuitement cette formidable collection aux chercheurs, aux lecteurs, aux lectrices de partout dans le monde, dans la mesure où ils ont accès à Internet. McGill Rare Books and Special Collections also have a long-standing friendship with Professor Cronk. In 2018, Professor Cronk co-curated an exhibit containing highlights of the J. Patrick Lee Voltaire collection. Once again, his curatorial work on the current exhibit, featuring materials from the Jacqueline Lambert-David Voltaire Manuscript collection, has been instrumental. Colleagues have also mentioned to me that over the years you have spent many happy hours researching and making discoveries and making an appointment with books and documents in our reading room. You're always welcome. It is your library. Hearing this brings me great joy. To more discoveries to come. Professor Cronk, the podium is yours.
Thank you so much. I'd first of all like to thank Dr. Guillaine Baudry for the invitation to be here, which gives me huge pleasure and happiness, and to thank you for this very too generous introduction. Just earlier at the vernissage, an hour or so back, some of us heard Peter Southam talk about the collection and the origins of the collection in his family over 4 generations and the role that his mother played in bringing it together. And I have to say, Peter, I found what you said incredibly moving. This is not just a great collection, but the story of it is extraordinary and special. For me personally, it's a fantastic honor to be here to help celebrate the arrival of this collection in the Library of McGill. I should also say that the library has done an amazing job in preparing the exhibit, which you must all see if you haven't seen it yet. And I think on behalf of all of us, we should thank the team in the library, Christopher Lyons and all his colleagues, and particularly Anne-Marie Holland, who's worked very hard in pulling together what is a really wonderful exhibit. And finally, I know there are colleagues and friends I can see here from CSEX, the Société Canadienne d'Études du XVIIIe siècle. Your annual conference this year is on Vie et forme de la vie, 1660 à 1820, or Matters and Materials of Life. Actually, I hope this is a proper introduction to your conference, because this wonderful exhibition is all about one aspect of materiality of 18th century life. Well, here is Voltaire. This is a painting by Hubert that belongs to the Chateau de Versailles, and they lost it, and it's just recently been refound in the cellars, and I've just put it there because it makes me laugh. But it's a picture of Voltaire from the time that he lived in the Chateau de Ferney. This is the Chateau de Ferney, not the most famous image, but it's a watercolor produced by probably a literary tourist or a literary pilgrim who went to the Chateau de Ferney to relive the spirit of Voltaire in the 19th century. So this is probably a glimpse of Ferney at a time when Peter's family were living in the chateau and collecting the manuscripts, some of which we saw today. I think the arrival of this collection in the library is a really special event, and Peter Southam's and his family's generosity is inspired because, as has already been said by Guylaine Baudry, the McGill Library has now become one of the world's major centres for the study of Voltaire. It really is on a par with the other great centres in Houston and the New York Public Library and Geneva, but this is an extraordinary collection of world importance. And what makes this collection really special is that it isn't simply one person's collection, but what you now have at McGill are several collections from different sources, collections that have different facets and different characteristics. I'm not today going to talk in detail about the holdings of this particular collection, because in a way that will be premature. There's a book in preparation by Marc-André Bernier, Nicolas Dion and colleagues. Sadly, they can't be here tonight. And I'm sure when that volume comes out, we'll have a proper catalogue raisonné of the whole collection, and that will be the time for more in-depth academic research, or the beginnings of academic research onto this collection. I thought what I could do this evening would be to provide some of the context to help explain why this donation is so hugely important. So I'd like to say something about the existing holdings of Voltaire material in this library, and speak generally about Voltaire manuscripts. A colleague in Oxford, Catherine Sutherland, has recently published a wonderful book with the title Why Modern Manuscripts Matter. And in this book, she looks at English literary manuscripts from Samuel Johnson and Walter Scott to Jane Austen. And with her title in mind, I really wonder whether I could call this lecture Why Voltaire Manuscripts Matter. In the French sphere, we're all familiar with those writers, mainly 19th, early 20th century, Flaubert, Proust, Valéry, who kept enormous numbers of manuscripts. They kept all their working drafts. It's become almost a sort of French industry, like critique génétique. If you work on Valéry or Proust or Valéry, you can not only look at the evolution of each book, you can look at the evolution of each book sentence by sentence. La critique génétique, or genetic criticism, is a very particular form of literary study. Sadly, or maybe happily, you can't do that for Voltaire. Normally in the 18th century, writers do not keep working manuscripts in the rather fanatical way that Proust and Valéry did. There are a few exceptions. That's an example of a manuscript of Candide. It's in the Arsenal in Paris. It was only discovered in the 1950s. It was forgotten until the 1950s. This is written by Voltaire in in 1758, so the year before Candide was published, and it gives you an example of how his thinking was proceeded. And you can do a genetic study of this. There's a famous scene where Voltaire encounters an escaped slave, and Candide weeps. That scene is not in this manuscript, so we know it's a late edition. So there is a little bit of genetic study that's possible with Voltaire, but this manuscript is totally exceptional. The reason for that is simple. In the 18th century, authors usually did not keep working drafts. When the final manuscript was sent to the printer marked it up for preparation by working out the page breaks and so on for the compositor, and then, just think of it, the manuscript was thrown away and the printed book appeared. What we would give to have the marked up copy of Candide, Voltaire's manuscript marked up by Camère's printers in Geneva, that will be a real treasure, but we know it doesn't exist. None of these things exist. Every writer has a particular relationship to his or her manuscripts. Rousseau, for example, as in everything the opposite of Voltaire, liked to offer gifts of his works to his admirers, normally his female admirers. And these were beautifully calligraphed manuscripts, manuscrits d'apparat. And they're all, of course, incredibly beautiful objects. They were gifts. And Voltaire himself was a copyist and a gifted calligrapher. Voltaire is completely different. And I suppose I tried to think, as I was preparing this talk, what is it that singles out Voltaire's manuscripts? My first thought was there is a strong element of serendipity in what has survived. There really is. There's a lot of chance in what happens to survive the ravages of the ages. But some things can be, and some things can still surprise us. What we badly need is a list of what survives, a list of Voltaire's manuscripts. And we are trying to prepare one at Oxford. So it will be called the Catalogue des manuscrits relatifs à Voltaire. We have a wonderful postdoc called Dr. Zoe Scraty, who's working on it at this moment. And I think in the course of next year, there will be a first version that will be released online, open access. It won't be definitive, but it will have at least the best available knowledge of these manuscripts are all over the world, a large number are in St. Petersburg. The Russians still haven't really fully catalogued the collection that arrived in 1778, so we can beat that, or 1779. This will be an incredibly useful device. We might even want to come back to the library one day and present this to the library, because we're trying to present a sort of exemplary manuscript catalogue that will be online, digital, freely available, but can all be constantly updated. So one task for the year or so to come will be to catalogue carefully the collection that we're talking about this evening and record it in this catalogue. But in the absence of this catalogue, I thought I'd try to give you a sense of what has survived. Well, to start off, let me show you a manuscript from McGill. This has been here for about 100 years. This is McGill's, I think, first Voltaire acquisition. It's a letter that came up at a London sale in the 1920s, and I think McGill bought it from a bookseller in London, Atkinson, so just about 100 years ago. It's a lovely letter. This is Voltaire's hand. The characteristic signature is just the V at the bottom, rather modest V, but that's how he wrote to his friends. He's writing to Suzanne Curchod, who was the wife of Necker, a famous Minister of Finance in the Ancien Regime. So this is a high-profile correspondent. And some clown has written at the bottom, Voltaire in ink, Voltaire initial, in a letter to Madame Necker. This was not a librarian, clearly. This was a bookseller, and they don't do things like that anymore. Anyway, then to try and give you a sense of what sorts of manuscripts exist, this is something which I think we've got in the collections of the Voltaire Foundation. My colleague's nodding, so that's reassuring. This is a working draft. It's not sensation interesting, but this is how Voltaire did his work. Large piece of paper, folded, so you have two columns, and then he has a text and handwriting, and there you can see a chapter from the Siècle Louis XV in the process of being revised by Voltaire. There are very few of these examples. It doesn't tell us very much. It just gives you a slight sense of how Voltaire worked on a day-to-day basis. And this is another piece, something which I particularly love. I've worked on Voltaire's book about England, the Lettres sur les Anglais, or the Lettres philosophiques. This is a notebook. This is from St. Petersburg. This is a notebook that Voltaire kept when he was living in London and in the 1720s. And as he read things in English or heard anecdotes, he records what he finds, partly with a view to using them later in his writings. So that first sentence, if you can read it, England is meeting of all religions, as the Royal Exchange is the rendezvous of all foreigners. Well, that's a nice sentence because, first of all, that idea is not Voltaire's. That comes from Addison's Spectator, so he's read Addison's Spectator. But later on, he'll reuse the idea in the Lettres pour les Anglais in letter 6. So his notebook there, so I'm doing the genetic study here that I said you couldn't do, but that notebook marks the stage between Voltaire reading Addison on the one hand and writing the Lettres philosophiques on the other. And it's special because it's in St. Petersburg. Of course, in a way, we look at that, Voltaire's notebook as he travelled in England in the 1720s, and we dream about the idea that the manuscript puts us in close touch with the author. I came across a wonderful example the other day. The library in Ferrara in Italy contains an extremely famous manuscript in the hand of Ariosto, and it's one of the great treasures of the Library of Ferrara. In the late 18th century, Alfieri, who of course becomes the great Italian tragedian and poet, and Alfieri had a deep veneration for Ariosto. He went to the library and asked to look at this manuscript, and it was given to him, and he was very moved. And he then said, could he write his own name at the foot of the manuscript, a bit like signing the visitor's book? And bizarrely, they said yes. So this great manuscript, in the hand of Ariosto, has Alfieri's name at the bottom. When visitors later in the 19th century went to the library at Ferrara, the librarians would proudly show this manuscript, and they would show also the hand of Alfieri, and they would also show that the words at the bottom of the manuscript were smudged. And the librarian explained this is because Alfieri shed tears over the manuscript. Well, it's a wonderful example of the piety and devotion that can be inspired by manuscript, and it's an absolutely appalling example of sort of library conservation. I'm sure this would never happen in McGill. But of course, then I thought, well, how many manuscripts are there really of Voltaire that really give you a close sense of the person? There are a few. This is a manuscript which I found quite recently. It's Voltaire, 1741. He's writing to his niece, his beloved niece. She later becomes his mistress, and her husband is a young married couple. They live in Lille, Voltaire's in Brussels, and he writes to her basically to say that he wants to visit in a few days. It's a letter to say, I'll see you soon. But it's charming. Mes très chers et très aimables enfants, j'arrive à Bruxelles. Je vous fais mille tendres compliments. Ma chère nièce, he finishes off, he makes a joke about being blind at the end. Adieu, parents et amis, jusqu'à jeudi, Voltaire. And his niece, he signs Voltaire. It's very charming. And this is a wonderful example of Voltaire, for once, actually being quite intime. There you have a letter entirely in his hand. Well, apart from the date, I think that's been added. And it's a totally intimate letter that was never copied. These are actually quite rare. At the other end of the spectrum, just to prove that discoveries can still be made, there's another Voltaire, wholly in Voltaire's hand. This has just been discovered. This belonged to a teacher in Oxford. This letter was bound inside a book, and we didn't really know about it till a couple of years ago. It's Voltaire. He's in London in the 1720s. He's published La Henriade, an epic poem. He's very keen to get royal approval for a poem that rather criticizes the Catholic religion, so it's difficult. And other people have said no to the edition, so he desperately has one last throw of the dice, and he tries to get the approval of the French queen, Marie Leszczyńska, who was famously, of course, Catholic, devout, pious, so the least likely member of the royal family to approve of La Henriade. But he tries, so that Voltaire, living in London in 1728, writes to the Queen of France in French. À la reine, long space, Madame, long space, est en sujet de votre majesté, etc. It's a lovely letter. In the codes of 18th century epistolary etiquette, the more space, paper was expensive, the more space you left after the initial address, the more deference you showed. So as he's writing to the Queen of France, he takes the whole page to say, à la reine, madame, and so on. Anyway, it's a wonderful letter, and it goes on like this. And at the end, he signs off, à Londres, avril 1728, le très humble et très soumis et très fidèle serviteur, Voltaire. So he does his best. As far as we know, she never answered the letter, so it didn't work, but it's a nice example. These things are really our chance survivals. How this letter ended up where it is, we don't really know. It got bound inside a book. The book just happened to turn up. So serendipity does go on playing a role. But beyond just serendipity, and these few examples I wanted to show you that really give you the sense of Voltaire's hand. What I really want to suggest in this talk is that the determining factor, I think, in the survival of Voltaire's manuscripts is his celebrity. Voltaire is a writer who absolutely dominates his century. Victor Hugo wrote, Voltaire a résumé dans son œuvre le XVIIIe siècle. Well, you can't really say more than that. He then goes on to say, moi-même je domine le XIXe, but that's another story. Voltaire's fame is completely unprecedented in the period, and Antoine Lilti, the historian, writes that Voltaire is the first modern celebrity. And of course, that fact shapes the corpus that we have today. Celebrity, as I'll try to say now, works in two ways. Celebrity can produce beautiful manuscripts, and celebrity can also produce scruffy manuscripts. So there are two headings, beautiful and scruffy. But first of all, I thought I'd just make a slight diversion and talk about celebrity autographs. I mean, names can be funny. That's a letter, that's a document Voltaire signed when he was living in London. And look how he anglicizes his name. He signs a document in London, Francis Voltaire. So I wrote that. So you can see why, among many autograph collectors, these things used to get cut out. And occasionally you see the tragedy in a bookseller of a manuscript with the signature that's been carefully cut out by someone who was precisely in search of an autograph. The serious business of autograph collecting is something that begins in the 18th century. The 18th century begins the cult of the great writer, so the idea that you want to own a bit of the genius, a bit of the great person. Catherine Southam, who's written about this, I'll quote her, by the 1820s, autograph hunting was a widespread amateur and middle-class enthusiasm within the reach of the modest collector, contributing to the beginnings of a democratic celebrity culture. It's interesting. So at least in England, the celebrity autograph becomes very prominent at the time of Romanticism. The Romantic poet Robert Southey talks about autograph collectors as, I quote, a troublesome and increasing sect. Before I go back to France, I thought I'd just show you one example just because I like it. We're in 1841, so when the autograph craze, as Catherine Southam calls it, is still at its height. And a certain Mr. Reed, who lives in Leeds, decides he wants the autograph of a person who was then a hugely best-selling novelist, Maria Edgeworth, who was then in her early 70s. She'd been famous for a very long time. So he writes to Maria Edgeworth, asking for a sample of her writing. The letter doesn't survive, but it clearly was a rather creepy letter because he's rather grovelling, and he includes in his letter a self-addressed envelope with a 1-penny stamp, saying that he doesn't want her to go to any expense, but he would like her autograph. Well, Maria Edgeworth's reply, which is in the British Library, is an absolute masterpiece. I'll read you the whole text because it's worth it. Sir, whether or not you have bestowed a penny well, she's quoting him back to himself, we must leave it to future times to tell. But since you actually have staked this ready penny upon the chance of my having the good nature and courtesy, it's another quote back, as you stated, I will grant you the mighty boon begged in your letter. I cannot but vouchsafe it to you. So, by the head of our queen, our gracious queen, that's the penny stamp, here is my autograph. Upon condition that you do not betray me to other autograph hunters, whom I could not find time or good nature perhaps enough to satisfy. Witness this my hand, this 7th of April 1841, Maria Edgeworth, Edgeworthstown, Ireland, now at number 1 North Audley Street, with her sister in London. Now, it's a lovely letter because, of course, it's jokingly legalistic by this hand. She makes fun of his language by throwing it back at him. She sort of implies he's a bit stingy by talking about the 1-penny stamp. And I'm sorry, I'm just losing my page. But then, let me show you the object. It's not a very good picture. But you see what she's done? She doesn't bother. He sent her an envelope with a stamp. She doesn't bother to actually give him a piece of paper. She writes that letter I've just read inside the envelope, which he then folds back. And of course, this is wonderfully wicked because, of course, if in his enthusiasm he rips the letter open, he will destroy the very thing that he's written to ask for. And aware of that, she writes on the outside of the envelope, which you can't see here, open cautiously. So I think there's certainly another exhibition for the library which would have autographs. There's a great history to them. But to come back to Voltaire, I think in the French 18th century, it was less common to to try to get a sort of mindless autograph. It was more common to try to get a letter from a famous person, and this is, of course, where the collections we're talking about comes in. If you were extremely famous or a very close friend, you could ask Voltaire to give you a book. So one form of autograph, of course, is the inscribed book, and there are lots of those. A very special example would be the quarto edition of the Henriade that in 1745 Voltaire sends to the Empress of Russia, Elizabeth Petrovna, so she's the daughter of Peter the Great. And for that, Voltaire actually writes, this is a copy of a fraction of the page, he actually writes a poem that begins à Sa Majesté Impériale, and it's a frightfully grand Voltairean poem. Sémiramis du Nord, auguste impératrice et digne fille de Ninus, le ciel me destine à peindre les vertus. And it goes on in that vein. So to an empress of Russia, you don't just get an autograph, you get an entire poem. If you weren't a close friend, then the easiest way to get a letter from Voltaire was obviously to write him a letter, and there was a certain epistolary etiquette that you had to reply. If you were famous, of course, it became a bit of a chore, and eventually Voltaire took out an advert in the Mercure, and I think it was in 1761, where he said, people who write to me going forward cannot bank on getting a reply from me, it's costing too much. So there was a sort of warning to autograph hunters, publicly printed in the Mercure, I can't just write a letter for nothing. Some of you may know the story about Philip Larkin, the English poet. When he was librarian of the University of Hull, he had to resort to using a rubber stamp to recall overdue books, when he suddenly dawned on him that readers were deliberately not returning their books because they wanted to get one of his autographed notes asking for the book to be returned. So there are problems that come with celebrity. In the 18th century, then, if you didn't just crudely ask, like poor Mr. Reed and Maria Edgeworth, you wrote a letter to Voltaire and you hoped he'd reply to you. Sometimes, to try and increase the chance of reply, people would write to Voltaire in poetry, normally bad poetry, hoping that Voltaire would then sort of double or quits, he might write back with a better poem. If you were then really desperate, you could do what Joseph Vaselier did. He worked in the post office at Lyon, which handled all Voltaire's letters that went from Ferney to Paris, went through Geneva and Lyon. And he would send gifts to Voltaire, peas if they were in season, or artichokes. So Voltaire receives from the postman in Lyon bad poetry and artichokes. And so Voltaire has to do something. So he writes at least and thanks him for the artichokes. And after Voltaire died, Joseph Vaselier published a rather slim volume of Voltaire's light verse, all culled from the letters that he received from Voltaire over the years. It's a rather nice story. In 1775, an 11-year-old girl who lived in the southwest of France sent to Voltaire a poem that she'd written to celebrate his 81st birthday. So there was an 11-year-old girl being encouraged, perhaps by her parents, to get a great letter from the great man. And so she wrote him a poem, which is not very good, I won't read it to you, but she was 11, and he writes back a rather good poem, but deeply inappropriate by our standards, telling her to go out and not waste her time on an old man, but go out and conquer handsome young men. I mean, it's the sort of thing you wouldn't really get away with now. Je crois votre estime sincère, mais quittez les moutons, les bois et la fougère. Allez sur des bords plus heureux, charmez les beaux esprits et captivez les dieux. Quand on a vos talents, on naquit pour leur plaire. So that was quite a nice poem to give to an 11-year-old, even if a bit inappropriate. From Voltaire's standpoint, as his celebrity grew, so letters, and again this comes back to an important part of this collection, letters become more and more central to his project of self-invention and self-projection. It's through letters that he can, because letters get copied, letters get published, and it goes beyond just the search for autographs. It becomes part of how Voltaire creates an image with his public. And that's central, really, to his whole sort of philosophic campaign. The business of autograph collecting has important consequences. First of all, it stimulates the study of paleography, which begins effectively as a new discipline in the 18th century. And secondly, rather less grandly, the business of autograph collecting creates a sudden interest in manufacturing facsimiles, or you could just say fakes. So that creates not so much a new discipline as a new criminal offense. The examples of this are very well known. For example, in 1769, William Henry Ireland discovered lots of Shakespeare manuscripts, and he said they were true because they had Shakespeare's true signature, and there was much discussion about their authenticity. Eventually, the fraud was revealed. The authentic signatures were totally fake. But by a nice paradox, the event had caused such excitement that the Shakespeare forgeries, in turn, became terribly collectible, and he still made significant profits. So every self-respecting library really should have at least a few fakes, and McGill is no exception. So the other early Voltaire item in your collections is this letter. It's a beautiful 4-page letter, entirely autographed, as you can see. It's very handsome, with a beautiful signature at the end, just the sort of thing you would want. And it's also got an address which you can read there to Monsieur Poncook. Of course, there's another Poncook letter in the exhibition upstairs in Paris, and it's folded, as you can see, to go through. The only slightly suspicious thing is if this was an original, there really ought to be some traces of the red wax seal that would have held it together when it was posted. But then if we go back to the first page, this is from the McGill collection. Someone, perhaps a slightly anxious librarian, has written in pencil at the top. If you look carefully at the top, facsimile. Obviously, there was a slight embarrassment in the library, and it was someone who's written it on. I would love to find out more about this. When was this actually printed? How many were published? What was the market for this? It's very interesting. So the first 2 Voltaire items in the McGill Voltaire collections were this facsimile and that lovely letter of Necker that I showed you that was acquired in the 1720s. Sorry, in the 1920s. This is a book which I found recently, published in 1817. It was for people who collected manuscripts and books. Facsimile de l'écriture de Voltaire, facsimile de l'écriture de Rousseau. So for someone who was collecting manuscripts, you needed an example of what did the writing look like. That's the thing we still need. So it contains an unknown letter from a then unknown letter from Voltaire to Frederick the Great, and a chapter from Rousseau's Émile. And this is a brochure from 1817, and when you open the book, the facsimile folds out. So it's quite a nice piece of printing. So there is the Voltaire letter, which folds out, and it promises it's to be a facsimile of the letter. This is Voltaire writing to Frederick the Great, so it's a very prestigious recipient. Sire, it begins. There's the customary space to acknowledge the eminence of the King of Prussia. And that beautiful Voltaire signature at the end, Voltaire in full flourish, which is there to really show you what the signature looks like. Of course, if you're used to reading Voltaire's letters to Frederick, he doesn't normally sign Voltaire, he normally just puts V. So that's a little bit suspicious. As it happens, we now know where this letter is. It's in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and thanks to Gallica, I was able to download the Gallica image of the letter. Now, if we put side by side, on the left, you've got the image. I'm sorry, the quality's not very good, but it's good enough to make the point. On the left, you've got the letter as it is digitized in Paris. On the right, you have the facsimile produced in 1817. And it's very faithful. The writing is similar. The space between Sire and the letter is similar. What have they've changed the signature. Notice in the original letter, it's very hard to read. Just in the bottom right, on the left-hand version, you can see that tiny V. That's Voltaire's signature to the King of Prussia. That's how he wrote to his friend. In the facsimile, which purports to be an accurate translation of the object, they've got rid of the V and they put in a handsome Voltaire. So it's actually, while purporting to be authentic, it's actually completely faked. It's worth just pausing for a moment to ask how in 1870 you reproduced a letter. Of course, later on in the 19th century, it will be possible to take a photograph of a manuscript. I'm looking at Richard here, he knows more about this than I do. We were discussing it in the library the other day. But later, from about the 1860s or 70s, there are various processes like photogravure and other processes whereby you take a photograph and through some chemical process you can turn the photograph into a plate and then print it. But that doesn't happen at all before the 1860s. So in 1817, there are that facsimile has gone through two processes. First of all, someone has copied the letter, and a second person has engraved it. So there are two stages at which the so-called exact facsimile can be falsified, either inadvertently or here, I think, on purpose. But it is an interesting fact about how we think about, well, I think it's an interesting reflection on the whole question of autographs and the whole question of our desire to possess the original. And when we look at the wonderful letters in this new collection, and we look at the vernissage upstairs, there are some fantastic letters that do have Voltaire's genuine, real, full signature. And when you go back and have another look, just admire those signatures. There are some wonderful examples there. Well, my arguments in the talk then is to say that, to try to understand what has survived of Voltaire's manuscripts. And beyond serendipity, I want to say that things depend on celebrity. First of all, there is what I've said here, the celebrity of the autograph, the letters that give us a sense of being closer to the great man. But secondly, and less glamorously, there are also manuscripts that are scruffy. There are manuscripts that are just copies of other manuscripts. And of these, in the case of Voltaire, there is a huge number. And they've perhaps been more neglected because they seem, on the surface at least, less attractive. Celebrity autographs are easy to like. They even made Alfieri weep. The second group, the scruffy ones, are unloved because they were made for reasons that we don't always really entirely understand. There's a serious point here. If you're obscure, no one really cares about your manuscripts. Arlette Farge, a historian who has a great genius for detecting and uncovering archives, has just published a really wonderful book called Vie oubliée, au cœur du XVIIIe siècle. It came out in 2019. And she explains that she's interested in leftovers, what she calls les déchets. She finds fragments of manuscripts in the Paris archives that reveal information about lives of 18th century individuals, abandoned children, drunken sailors, all sorts of notes from prisoners, people whose lives have otherwise totally vanished, apart from a tiny forgotten fragment, a déchet, in the archive. It's a very wonderful book. I'll quote, cet ouvrage est entièrement rédigé à partir d'archives, soit déclarées inclassables dans les inventaires des bibliothèques, soit par moi-même inutilisées, délaissées. Dans le langage universitaire, on appelle cela les déchets du chercheur. Well, what Arlette Farge doesn't say, of course, is that even famous lives, not just the obscure people, even famous lives do leave quantities of déchets, of waste paper, and Voltaire is absolutely no exception. Here's an example. It's not a scruffy manuscript. It's actually nicely written. It's a text from Voltaire's Guerre civile de Genève, which is a burlesque poem. It's a very funny, it's a rude satire about Genevan politics. The first official edition came out in 1768 when there was a civil war in Geneva, or in effect a civil war. This is very rude, it's very impolitic, and this particular canto is a full frontal attack on Rousseau, so someone has taken the interest of copying this out. Now, this is not interesting in any genetic sense because it's just copied from a printed edition. What's interesting is the hand of that manuscript, without any doubt, is Thomas Gray, the English poet more normally associated with slightly droopy elegies in country churchyards. He actually loved reading Voltaire in French, and he was interested in Voltaire's political satire. And actually there's a letter of Thomas Gray where he talks about Voltaire's satirical writing. So there's an extraordinary example of a manuscript, a sort of insignificant manuscript, which is fascinating not so much for the text, but for the reader, what it tells you about the reader, or one particular reader, and his relationship, and also the connections between Britain and France in the 18th century. Every manuscript tells a story, and that's a very interesting story. I've talked about the very earliest Voltaire acquisitions of the McGill Library, and then, as was said earlier, in 2013, the McGill Library acquired, thanks to a generous donation, the collection of Pat Lee, an eminent Voltaire scholar who died in 2006. It's a book. The collection contains books and manuscripts, but I'll focus on as I'm talking here about letters, I'll focus on the letters in the Pat Lee collection, partly because I'm in the process of looking at them at the moment. And altogether, there are 12 letters in the Pat Lee collection, only one of which is actually signed by Voltaire. Here it is. It's a nice letter folded, and there's a nice signature. You can see Voltaire. It's a secretary hand. It's written when Voltaire's in Prussia. He's writing to someone in Germany, but this is a nice example of a letter signed by Voltaire. The other 11 are all what are called in the Besson edition, it's a horrible phrase, old copies. And when Besson writes old copy, he normally, it's virtually tantamount to saying it's of no interest. Well, 11 of Patley's letters, 11 of the 12 are old copies, and they're absolutely fantastic. I've been looking at them over the last week. For example, here's Jordan was a friend, Jordan writing to Voltaire. Clearly this is a copy. You can see the paper is rather, well, you can't see it from here, but this is a very small format. It's really quite a small sheet. It's very thin, cheap paper. The writing is legible. It's not very good. This is someone who is making a copy of a letter for whatever purpose, and that's the research question, why are they copying it? It's not an original, but they've got access to the original. So that's the other side of the letter. It copies the signature, but it's not the signature, obviously. Another example is the Marquis de Villette, a very important figure in Voltaire's life. And you can see there, it's 2 pages. Now, if I, can I see this? You can see this. If I just go back to those 2 letters, there's something very interesting. If we think about the material object of the letter, in terms of the paper, this is very scrappy. This is the cheapest paper you can find, and it's been copied right to the margin, so it's someone who's also been careful not to waste paper. But if you look bottom right, you can see a hole in the paper. Can you see a sort of a white spot? And if you turn the page over, the hole is again there. Now it's on the left-hand side, obviously. And the second letter I just showed you has a hole, this time at the top left. And you turn the sheet over, and there's the hole on the top right. Well, I've been looking at, and it is a strange thing I do, I know, but I've been looking at these holes over the last few days in the rare books reading room. And, of course, it's interesting, because why are they there? Well, I think pins were used in the 18th as one way of classifying manuscripts. Pins, like we might use a tag or a paper clip, pins were put through manuscripts to keep them together. So someone, if I'm trying to work out why these letters were copied in the first place, I think someone was obviously classifying them, putting them together. And if you go back to the first letter, sometimes often there's a number on the top left as well that's been added, which again gives you the sense that someone is classifying them, putting them in order, perhaps for publication. Those are all things that can be researched. But then, still in the Patley collection, I found 2 more. So those letters I've just shown you were actually known. But this one, from Monsieur de Boissy de Voltaire, is not a letter that's known. It also has the telltale hole at the bottom of the sheet. You turn it over, there it is again. Another letter from Jaucourt, so a very important figure in the Enlightenment to Voltaire. This is not a known letter. I've checked and double-checked, but it says it's a copy. And given that the other letters are authentic, there's no reason to think that these aren't authentic. So I think that we've found at least 2 hitherto unknown Voltaire letters among the scruffy copies of the Patley collection in the McGill Library. When we were first beginning to discuss with Peter Southam what would happen to the Voltaire collection and it coming to McGill, one of the first things we said from the Voltaire was that these must be digitized at a high level, like the first thing for conservation, for scholarship and so on. So we had, as was mentioned earlier, everything was photographed at a very high level at the University of Sherbrooke by students. And here she is, or one of them. She has very erect posture. She's looking after the manuscript, being very carefully looked after, you will notice, Peter. And there is your collection being digitized at Sherbrooke. And I don't know if it's this student, one of the students wrote a very nice blog for the Voltaire Foundation, Mon été avec Voltaire, la numérisation de la collection Lombert-David. I do recommend that you read this book. It's very charming. And I've lost my place. If you Google the Voltaire Foundation blog, it's easy to find. It's for the 15th of November, 2021. And it's a very nice text with some very nice pictures. There's not time now for me to describe all the treasures in this collection. They're simply too numerous and too wonderful. But in keeping with my theme of celebrity and the compulsion to make copies that celebrity seems to entail, I say that this collection, the Lombert-David collection, does contain its fair share of really scruffy copies. And I say that, looking at Peter, as a term of the highest praise. As part of this contribution to celebrity, in that sense, it gives a very interesting cross-section of the sort of Voltaire manuscript that survives. So, for example, This is another copy. So this is not dissimilar to the ones we've just been looking at in the Patley collection. This is from the new collection. And you'll see at the top of the letter, it says copie de la lettre. And again, it's the same idea. It's cheap paper. There are no margins, so they're using every scrap of paper. There's a number in the top left of the sheet there. Again, someone has made this copy with a view to publishing it, classifying it. There's a system there. And then it turns over, and the letter finishes with a V signature at the bottom. I've been double-checking. I know Peter's done this work already. This letter is unknown. This is an unpublished letter, so this will be added in due course to the collection. And there are still others. Pro, I think that's one of the letters that's on display upstairs. Again, Pro was a famous publisher in Paris. Again, here's a letter that's a copy. It's not a smart copy. It's a cheap, everyday sort of practical copy. Again, this letter is unknown to us, so I think we have here another new letter to add to the collection. One thing I want to say, I just pointed out that there are certain parallels between some of these examples and some of the examples in the Patley collection. In bringing several Voltaire collections together in the same place, the value of the whole is always greater than the sum of the parts. And the Jacqueline David Lambert collection is hugely important here at McGill, not just in itself, though that already is significant, but for the way that now, in this broader library collection, it can resonate with the other items in adjacent collections. And that's really, as we celebrate this collection today, that's one of the things I would like to insist on, really, that it's important in itself intrinsically, but also for the way it fits into a bigger structure. And that is going to generate new knowledge and new research. I think that's very exciting for scholars. I also think it's very exciting for students. I think that people who are teaching Voltaire and the Enlightenment in this university will be able to use these collections. And this is going to be a very powerful way, I think, and I hope, to engage students in studying the Enlightenment. I think there's nothing more exciting. I don't want to go back to Alfieri weeping over the manuscripts, but I think if you can bring students into close contact with these items, you couldn't fail to be excited, and this could be a very interesting way to engage students with studying the Enlightenment. There's a book which I found really entrancing by Lothar Müller called White Magic, The Age of Paper. It was first published in German as Weiße Magie, and it's available in English. His broad idea is that we've overplayed the importance of the so-called transition from manuscript to print from the late 15th century. He really thinks that manuscripts never went away, and that so his book is not so much about the print revolution, so-called, but about paper as a medium. He tells the history of paper right from the start, and he really describes paper as being the great continuity of our culture. And what he insists on is the flexibility of paper compared to other forms of writing in other cultures. Paper can be used in different ways for different purposes. It's enormously flexible. And that's what he calls white magic. Well, I think the Jacqueline David Lambert collection has a great deal of white magic, if I may say so. Sometimes it's off-white, but it's still white magic. I'm going to finish very quickly with just three things which I just think are extraordinary. And I did this before I knew what Anne-Marie had chosen for the collection, and so we agree on the last one. But oh no, that was something I'm going to pass over to save time. So this is extraordinary. This is a poem, the Épithète Uranie. It's a poem that Voltaire wrote. It's a very important poem. It's his first major statement of deism, which was very controversial when he wrote in the 1720s. In fact, it was unpublishable. He doesn't officially publish it for 50 years. So it's a thing that is attached to his name through his working life. So what is this? I mean, we know about the poem. I should explain, it's about this big. It's been copied as a sort of poster, sort of thing a student might put in the bedroom. It's in 2 columns, as you can see. The text, I think, I've not studied in detail, I think the text is a copy of a printed edition, so it's not going to be interesting for Voltairean variants. But what fascinates me is just, what is it? Who wanted this? Who had it copied? I don't have any answers, I'm afraid, but it's a thing that we might talk about at one point in the future. It's just such an interesting object. I've never seen anything like it. Someone must have thought this poem was so important that they wanted it pinned up in their study, and they must have, perhaps they commissioned a copy. Anyway, it's a very, very remarkable thing. This is something which I really like. This is in Dutch. It's a broadside, it's this big, and it's a Dutch text that purports to be a Voltaire's prayer. Very crudely, I don't read Dutch really, but this is the translation very roughly. Lord, too often disowned, although proclaimed throughout the universe, hear from my uncouth mouth the latest supplication. My heart has loved you, but I, a human being, have sinned. I have, Father, denied you, yet search for your law. I see eternity approaching, yet see it without fear. Think not that the Lord, who called me into being, who has blessed me in this dark vale of tears when I have died, will punish me eternally. So this is another line on Voltaire's deism. This is the prayer of a deist written in Dutch. And again, I ask the same question. Why? Who did this? This is presumably the inhabitant of a Dutch Protestant state who wanted a Voltairean prayer. Who knows? Printed perhaps in his bedroom or her bedroom. It's possible to know. And finally, the third object I chose is one that Anne-Marie not only chose for the exhibition, but it is on the poster. I think this is wonderful. When Voltaire went to Ferney, it was a tiny, tiny village, and it was very poor. And there were workers who were leaving Geneva because of the civil unrest. So he decides to set up a watch factory. He actually creates it, and he brings watchmakers from Paris to teach the skills and gets workers from Geneva. And there's, of course, quite an interesting religious point there. The workers in Geneva were by and large Protestants. They're coming to a Catholic village, so he makes this into a sort of a utopian Enlightenment, non-religious factory. And he then writes to all his friends, including the King of Prussia and the Empress of Russia, saying, you must buy these watches. So he does a bit of marketing for the factory. Two of the watchmakers in 1775 want to leave Ferney and go to Gap. It's a town in the southeast of France. And they've been good workers. They worked him for 3 years. They're called Carré and Ronzal. And this is what you did if you wanted an artisan couldn't simply walk around France in the 18th century. You would have been arrested. You had to have a sort of passeport. So you normally got the mayor of the village to write you an attestation that you carried with you to make sure you didn't get arrested. Well, in this case, the two workers don't go to the mayor. They go to Voltaire, who's more famous. And that wonderfully grand hand is the hand of Voltaire's secretary, saying these are good men and let them go about their business. And it's signed, so the secretary writes it, perhaps a dictation, or the secretary was clever enough, he could probably just write the text anyway. Voltaire signs it for these two workers with quite a grand hand. It's one of his full stately signatures. But then I like the seal on the left, the red seal. So this is not a seal designed to seal a letter, which is its original function. This is a seal just to sort of show off, as though Voltaire's the king or something. And so that is red wax, and it's the perfect, that's the seal that's used at the Chateau de Ferney. If I could increase it, you can actually, it's an emblem that we use on the spine of the Œuvre complète de Voltaire. So that is quite a grand gesture. I'm finishing with a beautiful manuscript. And when I like the close-up there, the grand Voltaire gesture, the smart seal, all done for two watchmakers who wanted to go to Gap to get a new job. So it's a manuscript that's very beautiful, but it also tells an amazing story. The Jacqueline Lambert-David collection is a very, very special addition to the Voltaire collections of McGill. And it's an incredible privilege to be here with you celebrating it. It extends our knowledge of the writings of Voltaire. It brings new texts of Voltaire to light, which is especially annoying since we've just finished the complete edition, but we can always renew it. And more than that, these manuscripts provide amazing testimony to Voltaire's prestige and celebrity as a writer. The white magic of the Jacqueline David Lambert collection is going to enchant us for many years to come. Thank you, Peter, and thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Professor Cronk. We now invite guests or those who are watching, streaming the lecture live to send questions at the email roar.library@mcgill.ca. And for those who are in person, you can go to the microphone. We have time for 2 or 3 questions.
Yeah, I have just a very brief observation, but a longer question about celebrity. So in terms of Jewish studies, Professor Yaakov Dweck, who wrote a study of the famous 17th century Venetian rabbi Leone de Modena, has emphasized the persistence of the study of manuscripts, and that manuscripts were not superseded by print. So this seems to be a general observation in different areas of early modern studies. My question is about celebrity. I'd like to maybe push you a little, because twice you mentioned en passant Rousseau. And Rousseau's a great celebrity also, like with Voltaire, and his scholarship about Rousseau as a celebrity and all of the fan mail he received, et cetera, et cetera. Would you care to comment about similarities or differences between Rousseau and Voltaire as celebrities and how that may have influenced the treatment of their manuscripts?
Yes, I mean, thank you. It's a fantastic question, and the answer could be a book. It's wonderful, because I think Antoine Lilti says Voltaire's the first celebrity. Actually, I think I would say Voltaire and Rousseau are the first two literary celebrities. And in fact, in ways that are quite complex, I think each one sort of needs the other, because each one creates his celebrity against the other. So Voltaire, for example, well, let's do it the other way around. Rousseau insists that he will always sign his texts. He will always put his name to what he writes, because he's a man of honor, he's ethical. So he signs Rousseau, citoyen de Genève. And Voltaire thinks this is completely ridiculous if you're going to be sent to prison or fined or whatever. So Voltaire has any number of strategies for not signing with pseudonyms, signing anonymous, or not signing, leaving the books anonymous. So they have different strategies of authorship. Voltaire becomes wealthy in his life and uses his wealth partly to give himself a certain independence. Voltaire is poor, Rousseau is poor and plays on having patrons and so on. So in a way, each constructs their sense of celebrity against the other. They become equal, each needs the other in a funny way. I mentioned the fact that in 1761, Voltaire writes to the Mercure and makes a public statement. I'm now so inundated with letters, I cannot promise to answer them in future, I'm sorry. A few months later, exactly the same announcement is made in the Mercure by Rousseau, who doesn't want to be left out. So I think it's very...
Yes, thank you for this wonderful talk. So as you know, I collect manuscripts, and one question that pops to mind regarding Voltaire, because you know, in so many of his works, he's being provocative, and he disowns his own work again and again. How does he function to keep control, or obviously he hasn't kept control, of the more juicy letters, the ones to Frederick and all that? How do they escape his control?
So, yeah, it's a very, very interesting subject. I mean, letters, it's accepted in the 18th century that letters, very few letters are strictly intimate. When you get a letter from Voltaire or anyone, it's a big event, so you sit around, you share letters. So that's one of the things you have to remember when you read Voltaire's letters. You often have to know that you have to know who the intimate circle is of a certain correspondent and guess that certain things are passed on. We've mentioned earlier a letter to Damilaville. Damilaville was quite a minor functionary in Paris. He wasn't a great intellectual at all, but he was a close friend of Diderot. And we know that he showed everything he got to do. And that Voltaire and Diderot have a very difficult relationship. For a long time, they don't really write directly. They don't want to row in public, but Diderot doesn't really approve of Voltaire in lots of ways. And if Voltaire wants to get a message across to Diderot, he won't lower himself to write a letter, but he writes to Damilaville saying Diderot's recent book is a masterpiece, and he knows that Diderot will immediately rush round to show it to him. So to some extent, if you're lucky, you can be on top of the game and you can control what happens, but sometimes you can't control it. And sometimes things do get out of hand, and there are one or two problems about that. And there are famous issues. Sometimes if things get really bad, Voltaire will take out write a letter to the press and say, I didn't write that. But of course it doesn't always work, because people don't trust him, of course, it boomerangs back on him. The most famous example, I suppose, is the big row between Rousseau and Hume, which is a very complicated thing. It's a long, long saga, but essentially Rousseau attacks Hume for how he's been treated. Hume is a a totally decent man, but he's not very wised up to the sort of mechanics of celebrity. And Hume acts with integrity and cannot understand how Rousseau gets the better of him in the sort of, in public opinion, judges Hume badly all across Europe. And essentially, it's because he doesn't quite handle the press properly. Rousseau is much better at comms. And poor Hume is completely, he doesn't understand how he's got it so wrong. And there's a letter to Diderot where he says, well, I really don't know what's happening. And Diderot writes back to Hume and just says, I told you, be very careful when you're handling Rousseau. He's difficult. So there are lots of moments in the Enlightenment when it does actually go wrong. And there are quarrels, so that he doesn't always keep control of it. But I know you're interested in La Pucelle. I mean, that's a good example, where La Pucelle really is a manuscript worm. It's not even, I mean, the manuscripts, a lot of the manuscripts we have are not really pre-publication manuscripts. They're manuscripts of the oeuvre that circulated. And how he managed to keep that going and not get sent to jail is sort of a miracle. I mean, he managed to control the circulation and people play the game. But that could easily have gone wrong. In the case of the Epitome Uranie, he writes it in the early 1720s and sends it to a very limited group of people, and he keeps a hold on it. So a few people are in the know, and then there's a moment in the 1730s where it's still a manuscript, but he obviously releases it, and suddenly you get 3 replies in the space of a year, so you know that it's going around, it's doing the rounds in Paris. So to some extent, he can control it, but not always.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you
My pleasure.
for this exchange. Before we close, I would like to thank my colleagues in Rare Books and Special Collections, librarian and curator of Enlightenment Collections, and Marie-Hélène. Thank you so much for your work. Chris Lyons, Interim Associate Dean, Jacqueline Sundberg, wonderful outreach librarian, as well as Laurie Cloda, Vice Dean of Libraries, Lauren Goldman, Dolores Laprade, and Marika Ramundo, the library's events team, who did an absolutely wonderful job. Thank you for all of you for joining us for this moment. If you want to stay a few more minutes, we would like to continue the discussion and share a glass of wine with you in the foyer. I think, yes, we can go in the foyer before we go on with our evening. Thank you. It was absolutely wonderful to have all of you, and thank you to those who joined us online. And le meilleur est à venir. Thank you.